I'm back here with Jim Dimond, who's a faculty member of the School of Education and who has this wonderful background in learning design and education design and game design, and we're real excited to have him. This time we're going to be talking about mapping learning and game mechanics for serious analysis, and there's a lot going on in this article, Jim, and so let's kind of jump right into it. So let's, again, I like to start with these kind of with these terms we've been talking about a little bit, and then kind of unpacking the big concepts from here. So let's talk about, what is a serious game?
So a serious game is basically any game that has been developed that is not strictly for the purposes of entertainment, right? So most commercial, and it's not this cut and dry by any stretch of the imagination, but most commercial games would typically not be thought of as serious games, right? Those are games that have been developed purely for the sake of entertainment. Now that's complicated, because what does entertainment mean? That can be pretty subjective. But the way to make it simple is if a game has been developed by game designers with the goal of developing targeted learning outcomes, that's a serious game. If a game has been developed with the goal of impressing a player with a certain message or idea, right? That's a serious game.
Okay, great. So one of the things they talk a lot about in this article is kind of the barriers for game designers in not sharing a common vocabulary with the education experts. And what are some of the implications of those barriers? Where do we run into trouble?
So it goes both ways. It's hard. It can be hard for educators to talk with game designers, and it can be hard for game designers to talk with educators because they can have different objectives, right? So it's not always clear what a learning objective might be when an educator talks about it. Now, game designers get learning objectives, right? Because to advance in games, you have to have learning objectives. They're not necessarily stated the same way by those two different groups of people, but they both broadly understand that that the games as problem spaces have to entail things to be learned. And so what are those things that have to be learned, right? Now, that's not always an easy conversation for educators and game designers. And, and to be honest with you, learning objectives are not always easy for full-time educators to articulate, right? It can be very, very difficult. Learning objectives are hard to write. And so that's one piece. The idea that learning tasks in a game might be boring or may not be may not be especially challenging. That can also be kind of a rub space for game developers and educators, or isn't this frivolous? Isn't putting kids in games for learning, isn't that too childish, or isn't that too frivolous, or isn't that a waste of time? Because I'm not used to thinking about gameplay, about play, as something to be looked at for evidence of learning, right? And so those can be challenging conversations. Now, the good news is that those challenges can be worked through, right? And right, I mean, it just necessitates sort of listening from both groups, and stepping outside of their own professional spaces and trying to understand the objectives and goals that one another bring to these. And in my experience, they'll typically be able to get together and be able to start talking the same language.
Yeah, and we even talked about at the beginning of this course the importance of developing a unified vocabulary even within this course. Never mind other disciplines, and how important that is. Absolutely. Well, so kind of going with that and kind of following with that, they talk about on page 395 and 396 the learning model, the game model, and what I like to do is kind of unpack that with you a little bit. And they say the LMGM model has been designed to allow different users to describe games based on the basis of different pedagogical approaches. And so one of the questions that I have is that I'm assuming that's pedagogical approaches within a certain criteria. It's not just all pedagogical approaches. It has to be certain models of pedagogical approaches.
Yeah, that's right. Although I think you're identifying a weakness in that article, is that, I think they don't do a great job of unpacking what they mean by pedagogy in
Okay.
that article, which I think can lead to some confusion.
Okay. So what would be a better way to describe it from your perspective then?
So if we think about pedagogies broadly um, as practices, right?
Mm-hmm.
As things that a professional does, and in the
Mm-hmm.
case of a professional educator, things that a professional educator does to ideally improve the learning experience for learners. And what does that have to do with gameplay, right? So one way of thinking about gameplay, there might be a kind of game-based learning pedagogy, right? So what does that mean? Is it very behavioral, right? Is it a very sort of behavioralist oriented pedagogy, where there's a really clear connection between, do a thing and something happens, and then reward that if the right thing happens, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or don't reward it if the wrong thing happens, and then have it happen again and again and again, right? So that's a kind of behaviorist, I think, pedagogical orientation to game design. Or do you take a more constructivist oriented approach to game-based learning,
Mm-hmm.
which gives the learners as players more space and more opportunity to put their understanding of the problem space
Uh-huh.
into practice,
Uh-huh.
and to make decisions again based on the feedback, right? So I think as a player, I understand some problem, and so let me now put something into practice via this mechanic or via this set of mechanics,
Okay.
and let me interpret the feedback,
Yep.
and then repeat or go on,
And
right?
then, yeah, right. Compete. We've talked about that before. Repeat or go on, right? And then being able to reward that successful the mechanic of being a reward given for when successful gameplay or a person achieves mastery of something or demonstrates mastery, I should say,
That's right.
through
Yeah,
gameplay. Yeah.
exactly.
So one of the things that I think that's really important that students are going to understand is on page 397, there's this really big chart here. And one of the things that I struggled with is this is a big chart. And there's a lot of things going on, as we just talked about. There's lots of different pedagogies. And one of the things that I would really like your perspective on is when we look at things like this chart here, and it's like, okay, there's all these learning mechanics, there's all the game mechanics. I have to map all this. Where is a good place to start? Where do I begin my journey in saying, okay, I know my pedagogy, or I know my learning objective, I should say. Let me use that. Let me see if I get that term right. I know my learning objective. And so now what I need to do is I now need to work with my colleagues to identify the game mechanics and then the learning mechanics that kind of correlate to that. And where's the best place to begin that journey?
So some game designers and some learning designers are probably going to have different responses to that question, right? I would argue that one, you certainly should not be starting with a game.
Yeah.
You should be starting way back with a piece of paper, and that has your learning objectives really clearly spelled out, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that's one thing. And then, more importantly, I would argue, is the behaviors associated with that learning objective, right? So what
Mm-hmm.
does
Mm-hmm.
an educator or a learner need to do? What do we need to do? What are the behaviors that we need to see to serve as evidence of learning progress, or to see as evidence of a learner trying something out in that learning objective space? So once we have those behaviors, we can start to work back from there, right? And at that point, you should start, I would argue, you should start identifying your learning mechanics, right? So now you do have to start to think about a game space, about a problem space, right? So what is an environment? What's a motivating environment? What's an engaging environment? That's going to allow for the practice of those behaviors, right? So I think you can start thinking about your play space then. And you can start thinking about the learning mechanics. So again, like in that motivating space, what do I need to see happen, right? So I would go backwards from learning objectives, behaviors, learning mechanics, and then very quickly to game mechanics.
Okay.
Right? Now, this is also where things I think get a little fuzzy, and it's because of this word mechanic, right? As I'm sure you know, there are a lot of different definitions of mechanics, right? So, as I was saying earlier, a mechanic in a very basic sense is just a verb. Not everybody sees mechanics that way, right? Some, even that Ploss et al. Article, in my view, tends to treat mechanics more as dynamics. So that sort of the relationship between the mechanic, the unfolding then of an event in the game based on the mechanic, the feedback, right? And then a player's next move, right? So some theorists and designers will think about mechanics in those terms. For me, it's easier to think about a dynamic that I really want to think about, almost at an atomistic level behaviors. And then I want to think about, okay, well, how do the behaviors, how does something that exists in the game allow for that behavior? And then how does the dynamic in the game space change?
Right. Yeah, I like the idea of that, because one of the things that I think is really important to see is when we start talking about dissecting games, we start thinking about what's the smallest possible piece you can get to, and then how do I add to that? So I like the word atoms that you threw in there, because then you get to what's smaller than an atom, a quark. Okay, fine, we're gonna go from quarks. What's the smallest game? And then we're gonna make an atom, and then we're gonna make a molecule, and now we're gonna have a compound, and now we have them, then now we have a thing, and then eventually we end up right with breakfast cereal. But that's kind of our chain of custody of construction. So I like the idea of really breaking that down, and that's so from when we approach this chart, right? So it makes sense for us to think again about the smallest components of what we absolutely need to communicate. The one thing I would add to that is, where would you say that narrative fits in that? Because we talked about learning objectives, that makes sense. But in this course, we're also talking about narrative construction, and because some of these things exist, and we talked about materials not existing in a cultural vacuum. And so, we have our learning objective, and kind of in parallel, is that where we kind of think about the narrative that our player is going through, that they're doing our world building in?
Well, I mean, so one, obviously you don't necessarily need narrative, right? But so I get that you're focusing on narrative. But it depends.
Tetris doesn't have much of a narrative.
Depends on the learning objectives, right?
Sure. Yes.
So
correct.
You can treat narrative as both a learning mechanic and a game mechanic. Right? So if narrative as game mechanic helps with context setting, right? It helps if a narrative is an arc, right? You're here, it's going here, you need to get here. Then that helps a player sort of navigate the problem space, right? As things are unfolding. And if the narrative is unfolding, then it's also a way to reflect on things changing based on actions that you've taken in the game. If the game is constructed as such, right? There's not always a direct relationship between a narrative in a game and player activity, right? You can have a narrative that just keeps running that doesn't necessarily have any relationship to what to what a player is doing. Now that's interesting, right? It's still, a narrative may still be a motivating element,
Mhm.
but there's a less meaningful relationship, I would argue, between the learning mechanics as
Yeah.
such,
Yeah.
and the narrative. And
Okay.
the research is interesting because it's a bit mixed, right? Players don't necessarily, well, many players don't need to have a narrative for the game to be motivating, because you're either constructing your own narrative or you're doing something else.
Right.
But there are some players that find it very motivating to see to see a narrative change based on
Mhm.
the activity they've taken. So from a learning mechanic perspective,
Yeah.
right, a narrative could be a tutorial,
Uh-huh.
right? It's a way of telling. And games aren't necessarily great devices for telling, right? I mean, we have other media formats that I think are better,
Yep.
right? Because they're sort of more author oriented, right? If I have
Mhm.
a story I want to tell, then I'm going to do it in film, or I'm going to do it via a narrative text. And sure, I get that you're going to interpret, but to go back to this notion of procedurality, right?
Yeah.
I know there's not a lot you as a reader can do about my narrative, right?
Right.
Now, in other types of narratives, if there's space for it to open up and respond, well, then that narrative needs to serve as a form of feedback, right? So there
Mhm.
too, again, I think it's sort of straddling this line of learning mechanic and game mechanic,
Yep.
because that narrative or the change in the narrative should give a player some insight into the effectiveness of their use of the
Mhm.
mechanic. Does that make sense?
It does. And so I really like a lot of that. And one of the things that I think that's really interesting is that where you're talking about the narrative moments is like, games have cutscenes, right? And that's one of those things that they use to move the plot line along, but they're not long. They're
Typically
short.
not. Right,
You
exactly.
know what I mean? You might have an intro thing that kind of kicks up. And again, I'm thinking about video games here, but just, you have those initial things that kind of launch the story, and then you've got those little cutscenes, and they're almost treated as rewards or interludes
Mhm.
between chapters within the game to further the plot to reestablish effectively at that moment that, oh right, yeah, I'm playing in a universe, right? Oh right, yeah, I am playing it. But
Right.
it's not necessarily in service of I get of a specific mechanic, but rather as a thing to kind of hold your attention um,
Yeah.
in the intermediary parts. Yeah.
Yeah, and which is not to take away from it, right? I mean,
No,
narrative can
no.
be oh, sorry.
Thank you, man. I
Can you hear me?
yeah, I can hear you. Go ahead.
No, I can't hear you. Can you hear me? Oh, now I
Yes, go
can.
ahead. Okay.
Sorry,
Yeah,
I'm madly gesticulating.
that's right.
But a narrative, again, it can be very motivating for some players.
Hmm.
But if you've watched enough game players, right, you also know that cutscenes can be very irritating
Yep.
for other game players, right? They don't care. They don't,
Come
right?
on, come 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 on. Yeah.
Exactly. I want to get back to the space in which I can actually affect change, to the
Right.
space in which
Right.
I actually have agency.
Right. Right. Or turn around, he's right behind you, kind of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for this time. I really appreciate it. This has been another really insightful conversation into this. We've got a lot to unpack here. I'm looking forward to students really delving into this. And thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Can I say one more thing about
Yeah,
LNG?
absolutely. No, please, please, please. Yes,
Um,
yes.
that article is not an easy read by any stretch of the imagination.
No.
But I think in the broadest sense, it's a useful tool, because it should force us as learning designers to think in really concrete terms about the relationship between what we want our students to learn, what that learning should look like, and how we are creating spaces that enable activity, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
To build toward that learning. So,
Yeah.
those that can be very daunting. And there's not, there's an infinite universe of game mechanics, right? So I think the important thing is okay, we'll sit down at the beginning
Yeah.
and again, work backwards, spell out the behaviors you want to see, and then spell out the things that you feel as a designer you need to put into a game, which can include narrative. If you feel that a narrative is somehow going to support those targeted learning behaviors, then it should be in there, but include your rationale, right? So if you're going to create a game element, and you're going to work in this educational game design space or serious game design space, then be really explicit about why and how you think this element is supporting learning. It doesn't
Yeah.
have to be in the form of that LMGM model, right? You
Right.
can write
Right.
this out in a very nice narrative.
Right.
But I think that's really because there's other models, right? There's the MDA model. There's other models that are trying to do this deconstruction. But I think that's the important thing is really working backwards from your objectives and then being really explicit about why you think the game elements are in support of those objectives.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's really the kind of thing it's if you can start with the smallest component of what you're trying to accomplish and then build from there, build from there, build from there, build from there. The models are just really just tools to help you get to that point.
Exactly
Right.
right.
Yeah.
I think
Absolutely.
that's exactly right.
All right. Jim, thank you. This has been wonderful. Really appreciate your time. And we'll see you for another reading. All right. Thanks, Jim. I really appreciate it.